Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. Thank you. Thank you very much for that, and thank you for being here tonight. My name is Josh Masters. I am one of the pastors here at Brookwood Church, and in fact, I'm one of the care pastors that oversees our grief ministries here at Brookwood. And so we are so grateful that you are here, and we're so grateful that we could partner. We love partnering with people in the community and with organizations in the community, and I'm truly grateful to Thomas McAfee for allowing us to partner with you on this event. And so we always like to have someone come and welcome you and say, welcome to Brookwood Church. I hope that you enjoy the seminar. I hope you learn great tools, and if necessary, I hope you find great healing. So thank you for being here. And with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Jay McAfee.
You're welcome. Well, thank you, Josh, and thank you to everyone at Brookwood for making this possible. I spoke a little bit in our last session about how great Brookwood has been throughout this whole process, and I just want to reiterate our appreciation for Kristen and her team and all the support they've given us as we've gone through all of the logistics and changed course a couple of times as we dealt with the circumstances of the pandemic. We really appreciate your support to all of you at Brookwood. I'm Jay McAfee with Thomas McAfee Funeral Homes, and I want to thank all of you for being here. I know everybody has busy schedules, and the fact that all of you decided to take time out of your schedules to make this a priority, take time to make this topic a priority, that means a lot to us. It's something we feel is very important, and we're glad that all of you have assigned some level of importance to this topic as well. I want to thank our sponsors who make this possible. Many of our sponsors have been longtime supporters of this event, and that's very much appreciated. I would certainly encourage everybody in attendance to take some time to go around to the sponsor booths and visit with them and learn a little bit about their organizations. And finally, I want to thank Brenda Atkinson. Brenda is our continuing care coordinator and grief counselor at Thomas McAfee. And she runs our community education program. She's instrumental in the coordination of this event. So Brenda, we appreciate you and we appreciate all you do. This is our 20th annual grief seminar. So 20 years ago, my dad, John, and my uncle Tommy, they had an idea for this event, and they had a vision for this idea of grief education among the community. And we are so grateful that 20 years later, we can continue to have this event, and we can continue to try to live out their vision for grief education in the community. In our industry, we have access to so many grief resources and access to grief experts like Dr. Hoy, and we're really fortunate in that regard. But we have this belief and an idea that we have a responsibility not just to educate ourselves at Thomas McAfee or ourselves in the industry, but also to educate the community on grief. We have this responsibility to educate the community in order to facilitate a better grief experience for families, in order to facilitate a more healthy experience for families. And so that means educating those who are grieving, that means educating those who will grieve, and those who will interact with people who are grieving. And that's why we're so glad to have Dr. Hoy with us today. Dr. Hoy has been a resource for our firm for quite a while now, for many years. We've relied on his expertise in grief, and I can say on a personal level that he's really helped shape my view on grief. and he's helped shape the way I think about our role in funeral service and helping people grieve. So, Dr. Hoy, really glad to have you here with us today. For anyone who is not familiar with Dr. Hoy's work, I'll give a brief introduction for you. For more than 37 years, William G. Hoy has walked alongside the dying and bereaved, as well as provided continuing education to colleagues in healthcare and human service professions. He holds a full-time teaching and research post as clinical professor of medical humanities at Baylor University, where he has taught since 2012. Prior to his move to Baylor, Dr. Hoy directed the clinical counseling program for a large Southern California hospice and community bereavement center. In addition to his graduate education in counseling, Bill holds the Fellow in Thanatology, the highest professional certification for advanced practice professionals in the field of death, dying, and bereavement. He is the author of more than 125 articles and a half dozen books, the latest of which is Bereavement Groups and the Role of Social Support, integrating theory, research, and practice. Bill and Debbie Hoy are parents to 2 adult children, and they make their home in rural central Texas, about 25 miles from the Baylor campus. It's my privilege to introduce Dr. Bill Hoy.
Well, what a delight it is to be with all of you this evening. It may be the 20th year that Thomas McAfee has invited families into an arena like this to talk about grief, but I dare say that for a good number of folks in this room, this is your first trip. And if that is you, I'm really glad that you've come tonight. Because in many ways, while the grief process is universal, when I am the one experiencing the loss, it is highly personal. And figuring out how do I make sense of this experience of loss when I feel so alone and when the world seems to have changed around me is really the crux of what I see us doing together tonight. The McAfees have provided a little handout that sort of looks like a church bulletin, and it will give you an outline of the direction that I'm planning to go. There'll be plenty of time for us to chat informally. Somebody will come around with a mic if there's something you'd like me to clarify publicly, and I'll be around after we get done here in an hour and 15 minutes or so, and I'd be happy to talk with you in a smaller group or individually as well. There are just a lot of things that we could say about grief. Tonight, I want to highlight just five key touchstones, if you will, for how we walk through this experience that we call grief. Perhaps for the first time, maybe for you it is not the first time. How do we walk through that experience? How do we make sense of grief in a world that so often seems fairly senseless? Here's the first one, is to know that your grief is unique to you. Now, that might not be a surprise or it might be a shock. I dare say that if you have been the recipient of any number of people who have said really stupid things to you in your experience with loss, then you think you're probably not doing it right. So what are some of the really stupid things that people say? Oh, well, how about, well, it's been 3 months. Surely you have moved on from that now. Or how about, you're young, you can have another child or find another husband or wife or any number of other kinds of replacement strategies. Or at least he's out of his suffering. Or, well, it's all for the best. Or God doesn't give us any more than we can handle. And any number of those things might be true. Unfortunately, they're not very helpful. Grief is highly personal. Now, in spite of it being highly personal, I would like to say some things about the grief process that might give you, if nothing else, some pegs to hang things on. One thing that we are fairly certain of, actually I'm going to say more than fairly certain, we are very certain in the bereavement caregiving field that there is no such thing as stages of grief. One does not start here and do this and do that and do another thing, and at some magical point, 5 stages or 7 stages or 12 stages or 26 stages down the road, I am magically finished. We know that grief does not work that way. And I think anybody that's been in the midst of the deep pain of grief probably has discovered that for yourself. Wait, aren't I supposed to do anger after I do this or that? The reality is grief doesn't work that way. But if it doesn't work that way, are there some things we can say about how it does work? I think there are. One thing we can say about grief, about it being highly personal, is that most of us need to do some storytelling in grief. I call that remembering. It's the part of grief where we sit around and we talk about the times we've shared, the places we've done, and the things, the events that we've been part of, and all those kinds of things. And it is extraordinarily important and helpful. Now, of course, the problem with that is that sometimes those stories create even more pain as we talk about the places that we've been, or we look at photos or things like that. Do not mistake pain, however, for bad. The reality is that telling those stories becomes this important healing balm for us. Just 1 week ago last night, I was in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where I'd been summoned by my family, standing around my brother's intensive care bed as we said goodbye. And one of the most important things that we did that night, one of the most important gifts that we gave to each other, and what I dare say will be one of the most important things we will do tomorrow night at the visitation and Saturday morning at his funeral, is to tell stories to each other. To remember the times, to look at the pictures, to recall the places. Will they be sad at times? You better believe it. His son captured it well last week when he said, one of the hardest things for me about Dad's death is knowing that Tanner, his not quite yet 2-year-old, will never remember his pawpaw. And indeed, that is so. So in the storytelling, there is both this good and this awful, but it is extraordinarily important. Here's the funny thing that happens. You see, when we're telling stories, we're not just talking about events and things we did and places we went. We are also talking about the values that we have borrowed or adopted from this person who has died. So when I tell the story of how my father, in November of 1970, when the Billy Graham Crusade came to Baton Rouge, to Tiger Stadium, on the Sunday morning of the Crusade meeting, it was common during those years that the Crusade team fanned out to churches all over the community. And to our church that morning, now remember this is 1970, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. If you were living then, you might know where this story is going. And to our church that morning came 3 people, one of whom was Miss Ethel Waters, a wonderful African-American singer who I think probably made the song "His Eye is on the Sparrow" famous. And one of the ushers in our Baptist church in Baton Rouge, as these 3 people approached the door, said, "You may come in and you may come in. We don't allow your kind in our church." And 3 days later, my father stood in the church business meeting to say, "I don't understand. I don't understand how we pay money to send missionaries to Africa when if someone who was converted in their ministry should come to our church, we would turn them away. That makes no sense to me. And he sat down. And 10 minutes later, our congregation voted not by a huge majority, but by enough of a majority to what was called open the doors of the church and say, whoever comes, comes, and we welcome all regardless of who they are. That was my father that fired that shot against the bow. I've thought about that. You know, when we went home from church that night, we weren't sure if there might be a cross burned on our lawn because there were several members of our congregation who were card-carrying members of the Klan. And it did not stop my dad from doing what he thought was right. Now, I've just told you a story about a man who died 25 years ago whom you never met. But you know him, don't you? You know something about his courage, his tenacity, his willingness to stand up for conviction. That's what storytelling does for us. It creates for us a picture of the values that we carry from generation to generation. And I am a changed man because of my father's stand. And you are changed because of the character that the person in your life who died this year or last or whenever it might have been imparted. What I encourage you to do before this night is over is to jot down somewhere in the margin of that outline or in your journal or on a napkin 2 or 3 or 4 of the character qualities that you have received as gifts from this person who died. Their compassion, their tenacity, their love of hard work, their care for other people, their generosity, their faithfulness, or any number of other character qualities that you could list. That's remembering. The second thing I think we do in grief, and these are not intended to be chronological because truth is I think we do them all kind of at the same time. I call it reaffirming, finding the anchors that support us in the loss. What are these deeply held values and beliefs? Now the truth is that when somebody I care about dies, the chances are fairly good that I have to take all of the beliefs that I've held up until now and hold them up to the cold light of day and ask myself, will these sustain me in this experience? Some of the beliefs that I have do, some not so much. If you always believe that we all live to a ripe old age and your son died in a car crash at 23, that is a belief that has now been shattered. If you have assumed that bad people are killed violently and good people go gently into the night, and your loved one died by homicide just because she was in the wrong place at the wrong time or connected with the wrong friend, then you understand what it means to have to hold your beliefs up to the cold light of day and decide what can be held and what not. What I encourage you to do is to ask those questions and then to find the belief system that supports you in this loss. For the vast majority of us, that probably has some meaning in our faith community. But it may be that there are beliefs that we've always treasured that we realize, wow, that doesn't exactly hold me up right here. What I can guarantee you, though, is that as those beliefs are knocked down, standing in their wake are the beliefs that grow out of the crucible of life's experience that nurture us and encourage us and give us strength for the journey ahead. I suspect that could be a part of why St. Paul said that we are afflicted so that in part we can be a comfort to others. That's how beliefs work. It's the third thing I think we have to do, and that's to come to terms with the reality of the loss. We live in a culture that you've probably noticed doesn't do death real readily. We've created a whole vocabulary so we don't have to say he died. We say he passed away, passed on, passed over, passed through, went on to glory, or any number of other things. The reality is that coming full face at the reality of death is extraordinarily difficult. I watched my brother die last Wednesday night, and I have no doubt when I walk into that room tomorrow evening and see him lying in the casket that with my sister-in-law and their children I helped pick out last Friday morning, that his death will become real to me in a way that it wasn't last Wednesday night. And that is the nature of grief. I learned it from my own mother after my dad died 25 years ago. She was, and you'll hear some of her wisdom through the evening, because she was the first widow that I got to know really close, up close and personal. And I remember Mom called me some months after Dad died. She said, "I think you'll probably think I'm crazy." And I'd fortunately been a therapist long enough, I don't think anybody's crazy much, except me. Not in grief anyway. I've met plenty of crazy people. And she said, you know, she said, "I was sitting in the living room a few nights ago watching Jeopardy like she and my dad had done ever since he retired." She said, "I heard a car door slam outside." Remember, it's been 6 months since my dad died. She said, I heard a car door slam outside. She said, "Bill, I was on my feet halfway to the front door when I realized, oh, that couldn't have been him, because he died. And I fell back into my recliner where I cried myself the rest of the night through." That's realization. That's coming to terms with the reality of the loss and how deeply this hurts. Don't let anybody take your grief away. Don't let anybody tell you ought to be over this by now. In fact, there is, I thought about it last week again. As Don was dying, I thought, my mom and dad are waiting, and they will certainly be greeting him, perhaps already had at that point. And yet there was a rekindling of that loss that seemed in some ways only yesterday. Dad 25 years ago, Mom more than 5. And that's the way grief is. It is never completely gone. It remains with us. And in a moment, I'm going to tell you why that's a good thing. Fourth thing I think we're all doing, and we're doing it all the time in grief. This is not a stage. It's just something we're doing in grief. You're doing it yourself, and that is we're saying goodbye. We're finding all kinds of places along the way where we have to say goodbye again. Oh, we did it at the funeral or at the memorial service. We may have done it at the hospital if you were, in these days, one of the fortunate few who was able to be present at the bedside of your loved one. We may have done it to a body in a casket or to an urn at a memorial service. We may have done it on a yacht scattering cremated remains at sea. We may have done it at a memorial service last holiday. Could have been lots of different places. Truth is, saying goodbye is something we do continually throughout our lives. Pretty early in my career, I was called upon to take care of a family where a dad had died by suicide at the age of 32. And our center was called, and I was asked if I would be present at the funeral in support for the 10-year-old, the 8-year-old, and the 6-year-old daughters whose dad had died. And I was standing fairly close to the grave when, at the end of the graveside service, everybody came by and said the inane things that friends are likely to say to newly bereaved people in such a circumstance. And I'm so grateful that I was close enough as everyone else got up and left and began walking back to the cars to be present, to see and hear the little private ritual that went on between the 8-year-old and her father. She took one of the yellow roses out of the flowers up on top of the casket, and she kissed it. She laid it on the casket. She patted it gently, and she said, "Goodbye, Daddy. I love you." And then she turned around and strove confidently to rejoin her family. I watched as that car left the cemetery. I never saw her look back again. My mistake would be to think that she had finished saying goodbye that day. I would dare say she didn't finish saying goodbye. She began saying goodbye. For some of you, coming tonight is your first chance to start the process of goodbye. This is not the end of goodbye. This is perhaps for you the beginning, or maybe it's a continuation of saying goodbye, because we say goodbye continually for the rest of our lives. When my nephew died last year and we stood to bury him right at the feet of his grandparents, I realized again, in some ways, we said goodbye to them when we came back to that same sacred place where we had been 25 years ago. And so it will be on Saturday morning again. And every time we gather, we say goodbye, but there are hundreds of times throughout our lives that we say goodbye. That little girl that I was talking about, I dare say she said goodbye to her dad when she went out on her first date, and Dad wasn't sitting there with the shotgun to remind the boyfriend to be good. I imagine that she said goodbye to her dad when she graduated from high school, and he was not there. I suppose she said goodbye when she got married, and her dad was not there to walk her down the aisle. I suspect that she said goodbye at the birth of her first child and probably everyone after. And all through the rest of her natural life, my guess is that she says goodbye again and again, and so do you and I. That, like remembering and finding the anchors or reaffirming and realizing or coming to terms with the loss, all of that is not bad. All of that is gift. All of that is our way to become reoriented to a new world that doesn't include this person whom perhaps I have loved more than anyone else on the planet. It seems like that is a cheap way to say it. It is not. Because you see, the grief process is not about getting over it. It is not about recovering from it. And goodness knows it is not about moving on. It is rather about enfolding this loss into the rest of my life so that I become transformed and changed, and I am a new person, a different person. I look back now on many losses in my life, that of dear friends, of several family members. I am a bereaved brother. I am a bereaved son. I am a bereaved father. And I'm a bereaved grandfather. I've had many experiences to which I have said goodbye in death to people in my family and friendship circle. And usually not in the first week or two, but somewhere along the way, one of the great gifts that comes about in grief is that we are able to look back and say, my life is enriched. It was enriched by his life, and in some weird way, it has even been enriched by his death, because I am changed. I have integrated this loss into my life. When we moved to Crawford, Texas, population 717, we moved from Orange County, California, population 7.5 million. Just a few months before we left our community in Seal Beach, California, I was sitting in my study in the front of the house one morning, and I heard the unmistakable sound of an airplane that was way too low. We were accustomed to airplanes in our neighborhood. We lived only 4 miles from the runway at Long Beach Municipal Airport, but this one was unmistakably wrong. By the time I got out of my chair and down the driveway, I could see the plume of smoke coming from a neighbor's home 100 yards away. perhaps because of a heart attack or some other experience in the cockpit, the pilot had lost control, probably lost consciousness, and had crashed this little airplane. It literally went down the chimney of the Lowe's home. By the time I got to the place 100 yards away, there were several others who had already come, and people were making sure, first of all, that our friends had gotten out of their home, a retired couple, and her hair was singed, and she was sitting in the living room as the airplane came down the chimney into the room where she was reading the paper. Miraculously, she and her husband both escaping serious injury. It took several hours for the fire department to get the fire under control. It eventually spread, to, at least in a little bit, to the houses on either side. Their home was completely destroyed. It stood as just a burned out wreck for weeks, maybe months. Finally, the construction crews came, and they tore down the remnants of that burned out shell of a house, leaving only the concrete slab that was before them. And then they began to rebuild the house. At first, as the house was framed, I thought, that house is about the size of the house that it's replacing. And then eventually the house took shape, and the roofing material went on, and the stonemasons came and the painters, and I realized this house is an exact replica of the house that had stood there. Some weeks after we left Los Angeles, I was talking to the Lowe's son on the phone one afternoon, and I was trying not to be judgmental. You know, psychologists do that kind of thing. I was trying not to suggest that they had somehow replaced their home and that was a bad idea. Trying to pretend that this awful thing had not happened. And I was talking to David, and I said, so I guess your mom and dad are back in the house. And he said, oh, yes, they are. And I said, I thought this was brilliant. I said, looked a lot like the old house, doesn't it? And he said, oh, Bill, it is an exact replica of the old house. In fact, they used the floor plan. My mother says the only difference is that now she has an up-to-date kitchen instead of the 1965 model she'd had. In fact, he said, a few weeks after they moved in, my mom and dad were out at the swap meet, the flea market, one afternoon on a Saturday, and they happened to spy a piece of turquoise shag carpet, just like had been in that living room. They bought it and brought it home and had the carpet installers come back and tear out the carpet, the new carpet they'd put in, and put that turquoise shag carpet in so that this house would be as much as possible like the home they lost. I was telling that story to our builder. He got a funny look on his face. And he said, Bill, did you say that they built the new house on the old foundation? I said, they did. He said, their contractor should have known not to do that. You see, concrete is porous, Lewis told me that day. It absorbed the smell of the smoke. And when they come back in that house, when the air conditioning is off, it doesn't matter if they have glued 12 layers of linoleum to the slab. There will be a hint of smoke in the air. It will never be gone. And I thought, what an amazing picture of grief that is. See, ladies and gentlemen, we don't want to move on. We don't want to get closure. We don't want to put this experience behind us. The only way to successfully do that is to forget the life we shared. And that is not what any of us here want. Rather, what we want is not to move on, but to enfold. To take this experience and enfold it into who I become. I am a different, I dare say, better man because of the extraordinary losses through which I have walked, and you will be too. Grief is personal. Only you know what your experience is. Your grief in some ways is like other people, but in most ways it is like no one else, because the relationship you shared with this person was unique between the two of you. If you are an adult child supporting now a widowed parent, I can almost guarantee you that you and your siblings grieve differently, and you grieve differently than your adult parent, because each of you had a unique relationship with this person who died. And that's one of the most important things that tells us how grief is going to go, is the relationship that we shared with that person. Your grief is yours, and yours alone. Don't let anybody take it from you. Here's the second idea. It's to seek sense in spite of the senseless. I've talked about this already, and I'll talk about it briefly here. Part of this is that for most of us, at least some remnant of our beliefs are challenged by this kind of loss. It might be that I just thought she was going to be here forever. It might be I just had no idea what this could be like. It might be I thought I had more time. It might be I thought we had conquered whatever this disease was, maybe in the last generation. It could be any number of things, but what I'm confident of is that for most of us, deep grief occasions challenged belief. I'm not sure that I quite believe everything that I did last week, month, or year. But in the process of examining the beliefs that I hold, I would like to suggest to you that we also find that there are some reaffirmed truths, or some things that can be reaffirmed. We can find joy and goodness and hope and amazing opportunities. Some of the most amazing things that have happened in the lives of bereaved people have occurred because they were bereaved. In 1978, Candy Leidner's daughter, Carrie, was walking with a friend of hers from a church carnival to a softball game when a drunk driver came around the corner in Fairfield, California, hitting Carrie, killing her instantly, and narrowly missing her friend. Some days after that horrific experience in which Candy's 13-year-old girl died, she and a friend of hers were driving past the scene of the crash and noticed a detective from the county sheriff's department out making measurements near where the crash had occurred. They pulled over and went up to talk to him about the status of the investigation. This detective, probably because Candy Leitner had herself all together, didn't look like a grieving mother to him, I suppose, whatever his stereotype of a grieving mother should be. Didn't realize he was talking to the mom when she said, "So what's happening here? What are you investigating?" The detective said, "Oh, well, a drunk driver killed a little girl here day before yesterday." Candy said to him, "A drunk driver did this?" And he said, "Oh, yes. In fact," he said, "it makes me so mad. Do you know that he was just out of jail less than 12 hours on his 5th DUI?" This grieving mother said to the detective, "Well, what will become of him?" To which the detective, again, somewhat flippantly, mostly angrily, replied, "Nothing will happen to him, because in California we don't do anything to drunk drivers." Candy Leitner said that moment in April of 1978, she heard birthed in her heart this line, "Not another mother. And Mothers Against Drunk Driving was born. An organization, a movement that has saved the lives of countless millions around the world because of its ability to raise awareness for the dangers of impaired driving. Does that make Carrie's death worthwhile? No. Not for that mom and not for anyone else. But out of the deep heartache and the ashes of such tragedy and sorrow was birthed great goodness and hope. And so it can be for you and for me. Oh, we may not give birth to an organization like Mothers Against Drunk Driving, but like many people, we may discover that the wonders that were offered to us by a caring hospice volunteer has now sounded clearly in our heart to give back by becoming a hospice volunteer. And we would never have known that that was a possibility or a need until we walked through this awful experience. What I'm really saying here, folks, is that part of what happens for us in the spirituality of grief is that what can be born in us is great transformation. I happen to think, out of my faith pilgrimage, that is nothing less than a work of the Spirit of God. You do with it what you will. Here's the third idea, is to look for the holy hush in a crazy world. My brother, who died last week, when he was improving in his health about 4 weeks ago, said to his daughter, "I'm not long. I will soon see Daniel, their son who died last year." I was telling the group this afternoon, there is a little by-the-way verse that's mentioned almost on the side in the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament book of Genesis. It's a genealogy of all things. Most people who even read the Bible skip right over those he begat him and he begat him and he begat someone else. We skip right through that. But in Genesis chapter 5, we come upon this little verse about this man known, to my knowledge, only one other place in the entire Scripture. His name was Enoch. And this is what the writer of Genesis said about this man. It says, "And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, because God took him." And what I was realizing as I heard the stories of the way my brother, when his health physically was improving, and him in some ways, I think, predicting that his life was short, what I realized was here was a man who walked closely with God, and I know that, and had the timidity to listen for the holy hush in his life. Honestly, ladies and gentlemen, I find a lot of us spend so much time at a frenetic pace, always on Facebook or Instagram or TalkTick or whatever it's called, always doing something, always running from place to place, always trying to do 2 hours work in a 30-minute time span. I suspect that many of us fail just to stop and be quiet and to say, "God, speak to my heart, because I know nowhere else to look or to turn." Here's the fourth one, is don't go it alone. I told you about my mom. Well, I gave my mom exactly 6 weeks to the day after Dad died to start suggesting that she join a bereavement support group. Well, like most mothers, she was not listening to her son, smart as I thought I might be about the whole matter. So I began to apply just a little bit of pressure. Probably about 10 weeks after Dad's death, I said to her something along the order of, Mom, I think a grief group would really be good for you. You know, I know Amy over at Hospice of Baton Rouge. She has my job there, and I could call her and find out a little bit about the groups they offer. I bet they've got one that would be just perfect for you, Mom. Probably with other ladies who've also had their husbands die after nigh on to 50 years of marriage. My mother's response, Bill, I've got enough problems of my own. Why would I want to go listen to everybody else's? So I let it go. Meanwhile, I'm thinking, my mother will not go to a grief group. I go all over the United States talking to colleagues about the power of grief groups and how wonderful they can be. And someday at a seminar at Thomas McAfee Funeral Home, somebody's going to walk up to me and say, oh, Dr. Hoy, now you said your mother was widowed. I bet she joined a bereavement group, didn't she? And I'm going to have to hang my head in shame and say, no, the old woman won't do it. Three months. So it's now been 5 months since Dad died. I call one Sunday afternoon because I am a very dutiful son, and somewhere along the way, a widowed person told me, Sunday afternoons, that's hell on wheels. Can I say hell in a church? That's the bad one right there, right? That's what's terrible. So I called. Well, at 2 o'clock, she didn't answer. And at 2:30, and at 2:45, and at 2:50, and at 2:51, and at 2:53, and at 2:54, and at 2:54 and a half. And now I'm nigh on to panicked. Where is my mother, right? I don't remember the time. It was way after 3:30. And she finally answered the phone. And you know what my question to her was? Where have you been? Like I'd been asked that question a few times in my own young life, right? And she said, oh, the girls and I heard about a new restaurant up at Jackson. We decided to go try it out today. What I'm thinking is I have an infant daughter. My brother in San Diego has a daughter. They're the only two girls in our family. And I'm pretty sure mine's with me, and I'm thinking Bob's is with him. I'm pretty sure she didn't go anywhere with any girls in our family. It's all boys as far as the eye can see. And I said, the girls, who are the girls? And she said, oh, it's Dorothy and Mildred and Margie and me. And I said, really? And she said, oh, yeah. We'd heard about this new restaurant, and we decided to go try it out 30 miles away. I said, do you do this very much? And she said, well, almost every Sunday. And I said, what? And she said, well, you know, the day after we buried your dad, that was Mother's Day weekend. The day after we buried your dad, you were all here with me, but the next week, I was by myself. And I can picture my mother to this day sitting alone in the pew in the Winburn Avenue Baptist Church in Baton Rouge that she and my dad had shared for the better part of 50 years by herself. And Margie came up to her and said, Lily Mae, we know what Sunday afternoon is like when you've lost your life's mate. And we have a little group of girls who get together. Would you come be a part of our little group? All the time I was trying to get my mother involved in a bereavement support group, she was already in one. A lot better than any I could have created for her. A lot better than the one at Hospice of Baton Rouge would have been. These women knew each other's husbands and their children. They knew their warts. They knew their foibles. They knew it all. And they were wonderful support to each other. Well, fast forward 8 years or more. My brother, who lived in San Diego, as I said, some big poo-pah-pah in the LSU Alumni Association, and he was in Baton Rouge for a meeting. My brother long ago became a Unitarian. He isn't a Baptist anymore, and he doesn't do Baptist church too well so much anymore. And Bob, I'll get the right brother here in a minute, you don't care, was in Baton Rouge for the weekend, and on Monday morning, I knew he'd flown back late Sunday night to San Diego. On Monday morning, there is a message on my voicemail. It said, "Little brother," it's what he always calls me, still does. "Little brother, you owe me big. Click." Now that kind of demands a callback, doesn't it? So I phoned him back. He said, I was in Baton Rouge this weekend. I said, "I heard." I said, "Did you go to church with Mom yesterday?" "Yes." He said, "I did." I said, "How was it?" "It was blessedly short," he said. "But then Mom persuaded me to go out to lunch with her group of blue hairs." There were 37 of them. Bob said, "If I don't hear about another ovarian cyst or breast lump or bad hip or prostate problem, it will be too soon." There are, to my knowledge, at least 3 marriages that have come out of this group. They were together that afternoon for 3.5 hours, Bob said, at the worst seafood restaurant in the city of Baton Rouge, because it is the only restaurant that has room for 37 people to camp out for the afternoon. I don't know what kind of group you have or what kind of group you need. It might be that your family is wonderful support for you, or it might be that you need something more than what they can provide because they long since have tired of the stories. It might be that it's a church group. It might be that it is a group in this congregation because they have grief programs here. It might be one of the dozens of bereavement groups online or in person run by one of the hospices in town. It could be any number of things. What does not work is to try to do grief by yourself, because it's very personal. But it isn't done well when we try to go it alone. Grief is communal. And then here's the last one, is to prioritize your physical well-being. How are we eating, sleeping, resting, and laughing? A few years ago, I was speaking at a conference in Houston, Texas. And I said to the group that night, I've learned in my work as a grief counselor that there are some things that are better to really limit in your diet. And everybody wants to know what those things are, right? And what I have found is that processed sugar, caffeine, alcohol, and animal fat work against good grief. They do not feed our body, and if our body is not being fed, then our emotions and our minds aren't either. So I listed my 4, and a man sitting way back in the corner yelled out, "I thought those were the basic 4 food groups." And indeed, that is the way a lot of us eat. And in fact, in grief, we tend, even if we were watched carefully what we ate before we were bereaved, often that goes out the window when we are bereaved. It is so much easier to reach for a Snickers bar than it is to cut up a cantaloupe. And what I would like to encourage you to do is to find a few really good things and load them to the front edge of the shelf of your refrigerator. And push the Diet Cola to the back, down to the bottom, where at least you have to get some exercise by bending over to reach down and get it out, right? Begin looking for some ways to move your body. Now, I recognize that we're at all different places in our mobility, our mobility or our maybe other physical conditions. So I'm not suggesting you go out and start training for the Boston Marathon. What I am suggesting is that most of us in America would do well to move more than we do, with the possible exception of Tommy McAfee, who's running all over Greenville, it seems to me, and that's why he's so thin, about 100 times thinner than me. But most of us would really benefit from a bit more exercise than we get, even if that's starting by doing hand motions or some squats or simply getting up and walking from our chair to the refrigerator a few times, or leave the TV control over by the TV and get up and walk over there to change the channel. Anything that kind of gets us moving can be very, very beneficial. And then resting, making sure that we are making time. One of the things I find grieving people frequently do is we are afraid to go to bed. It's lonely, it's quiet, the anxiety comes in. We may work our fingers to the bone all day, fall into bed thinking, surely I will get a good night's sleep tonight, and the eyes pop open and there I lay for the next 2 hours. Now, sometimes that's because we've been pushing the emotional work of grief aside all day, trying to follow the sage advice we were given sometime to just stay busy so we don't think about it. By the way, you can't stay that busy, and you can't do it for long anyway. But we work really hard to push grief away so that when the room grows dark and quiet, the day's emotion comes flooding in. It may be really helpful if you're having trouble sleeping to take a few minutes, 45 minutes or an hour before you plan to go to bed, and write. Get yourself a journal of some sort. I use a Moleskine, but any white papered book will work just fine. And begin writing. Write a letter to the person who died. Or write a notation in your journal that says, today I missed him the most at this point and that point and this other point. Or what was really hard for me today was this. Or today I felt the most angry or fearful or guilty or sad or whatever the emotion is at this point. Or as I look back on the last 3 months or 6 months or a year, here's something I'm really grateful for that has happened in my life. And spending a little bit of time doing that at night before we go to bed seems to have this amazing ability of taking all these thoughts that are up here and pouring them out onto paper so that we are released from them. Take good care of your physical well-being. Well, I've been jawing at you now for an hour. Or, yeah, pretty close, 45 minutes anyway. I'm wondering, is something that you've heard tonight, does it resonate? Or does something you hear and you think, yeah, but what about? And I'd like to hear what you're thinking or what you're wondering about, or what I've said that has been about as clear as mud. What are you wondering about? And the ladies are here with mics so that your question or comment can be well heard by all. But don't worry, it won't bite. Anybody? Just wave your hand around. Up.
Hello. Thank you so much for everything that you've said. I found a lot of value in it already. I was hoping to come tonight and learn a little bit more about grief during the time of COVID and what we're dealing with in terms of life as we never knew it before.
Yeah.
And that's what I'm finding particularly challenging is like a suspension of some of the grief things. You know, it helped a lot to hear about everyone's journey as their own. But I'm finding a particular challenge during kind of a flatline time during COVID. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Great insight. Yeah, let's talk about that for a minute. Well, I don't do anything in a minute, but so COVID, or the era of the pandemic, has changed grieving in so many profound ways. The inability to practice rituals, funeral ceremonies have been changed or abolished in some communities, or had to be delayed for a long period of time. That's certainly a part of that. The inability to say goodbye at the bedside. I realized that my family and I had a very unique privilege last week that if it had been 6 months ago in the very same hospital, we would not have had that opportunity. And many of you have walked through that experience. Your loved one perhaps went to the hospital and that was the last you saw them, and you could not be present with them, or you were out on the curb in front. This era has changed the way we connect with one another afterwards. So I made a reference a few minutes ago to perhaps you could join a support group online or in person. The reality is that in very few places was there even such thing as an online support group 2 years ago. The fact that we try to connect through Zoom or one of those platforms now, it's certainly better than nothing, but it is a far cry from being present around a table in the same room. I think that it is not at all an accident that though you could have watched this on your computer tonight, and many people did, you chose to be here, because I think there is something very powerful in presence. It's the reason that lots of people last year, I heard lots of pastors fearful that when online church became a thing, people might not come back. I don't know about your church, but mine's packed every Sunday. It's been okay for people to be back. And I think it's because we long to be with each other, even sometimes at great risk physically. What I'm really suggesting here is all of those things have changed the manner in which we grieve. And so what that is doing for us is it is calling us to have to find some creative ways. Online support groups, of course, would be one of those. Writing a lot more. I'm finding it much more important that we write during grief. We have known in the bereavement caregiving field for years that keeping a journal is one of the best things that grieving people do. You can do it on your computer, you can do it in a notebook, you can do it however you want, but to write, to reflect, to say kind of the questions that I was offering a while ago is very, very powerful. It is still grief only for me. It is not grief shared in that case, but it is a far cry from just sort of ruminating on the experience without. The phone still works, even if I'm not a fond fan of Zoom, or I don't have internet capability to be able to stream or all of that. I can still reach out to folks. What I did for myself last week, because what I've realized, and I think this applies, what I realized is that when you are a grief professional, you have to keep doing your work even when you are grieving. I mean, it's my day job. I don't really get a pass. I can't exactly go on bereavement leave for the next 6 months and not talk about grief. And so what I found myself doing last week was thinking, who are the people in my world who I know will be most supportive of me right now? And each day from Thursday through yesterday, I called one of them. Usually, if I had a cell phone, I texted them first and said, hey, I'd like to chat. do you have a few minutes this afternoon or tonight or something like that? And I initiated. It is sad that in our culture, we grieving people have to initiate toward friends, but the truth is they may not think to. For me, support has come in some of the most expected and unexpected places, but some of the people I expected would be supportive of me, I've heard nothing from. And that's the way this always works. And there's nothing new about that in the pandemic, right? And so one of the things that I've found useful is I just have to be a little more proactive in grieving during the pandemic, which is hard work because grief is exhausting anyway. So I don't have a lot of energy left over to reach out to people to try to build my own support system. And yet I don't know of anything else that is more important. I also think owning the experience that we are walking through is very, very important in saying, I don't like this. This stinks. The interesting thing, of course, is that everyone's funerals got caught up in the change about rituals, whether their loved one died of COVID or didn't, whether anybody in the family had COVID or they didn't. That was immaterial. All of those things changed. And I was so stirred as I saw the way the McAfees and others kind of stepped up to think about creative rituals, whether it was the balloon in the seat. What was that called, friends? Hugs from home, you know, with the little note cards that people could send into the funeral. I mean, those were creative things. And the truth is that I think what the pandemic has done is it has forced us to really rethink what's important. For me, it has really reminded me again that personal connection is more vital than I ever thought it was before. I think I always thought it was important, but I've really become convinced of it. And so I look forward with hopefulness to the day when we have this behind us, although what that looks like I don't know just yet, but when we are certainly more able to be together. And I mean, we couldn't have even dreamed of doing this a year ago. And so I think even that is a real reminder of hopefulness that it will not always be like it is right now. Those are some things I've thought about. I'd be curious if anybody in the room has thought of ways to grieve during the pandemic that have been helpful for you. Or if there's anybody have an idea, or what are you doing to take care of yourself in this very difficult time? Yeah. She's coming with the mic, so hang on just for a second.
I think music can be something that isn't affected by the pandemic. We can all go online and go to YouTube and find wonderful music that reaches everybody's heart in specific ways.
Yeah.
I know there are a number of singers. Danny Goki is one that comes to mind right now. And other YouTube programs on grief, things like that. I don't know how many people aren't online, but something like that.
Yeah, if you have access to online resources, YouTube is a great place for music and for other kinds of things, and it's free if you don't mind the commercials, or you can pay a little bit and not have to even listen to them. But I've found myself really listening to a lot more music. I sometimes will go online to YouTube, and in the search box, I will type in something like Psalms read out loud, and there will be 10 or 15-minute segments where somebody with a very rich baritone British, they are always British, voice reads the book of Psalms. And you know, there's something powerful about hearing another human voice, whether that's in music or in the spoken word or whatever, especially if I'm largely isolated, that I think can be very powerful.
Also, I was going to say, speaking what you just mentioned about hearing scripture or other poems or whatever read verbally, YouVersion is a good free app.
Okay.
online that you can go to, and you can hear somebody reading scripture, and they have various, a whole list of different versions.
Yeah.
But one other thing I've been thinking about since you've been saying that, and we've had 3 women in our neighborhood who passed within the last month, and one of them had told her family she didn't want any service, she didn't want, any visitors and things. And I was thinking about that because it's happened before in the past, that they don't realize that the funeral isn't really for them, it's for the bereaved. Mm-hmm. And it's really important for the bereaved to come together with people who knew their loved one. And like you said at the beginning, the telling of the stories. When my father had passed, I heard stories from people I'd never known about him. And those are so valuable and so cherished.
Yeah.
But
I learned last Thursday that my brother actually asked his wife to marry him during the time they were actually broken up. Who knew, right? I mean, that's a story that does. Now, by the way, I'm working that into the funeral somehow. I don't know quite how just yet. But my point is the stories are powerful because we paint in the corners of a life story that we just had never quite gotten all the little nuances of things. So it can be very powerful. And reaching out to other family members, I think it can be very powerful to reach out to a cousin perhaps and to say, I've been sitting here thinking about Bob tonight, and you knew a side of Bob I didn't know because you guys were kids together. What do you most remember about him from that? And to hear those stories can be very, very healing for us. Now, they do usually cause tears, so just get ready for that. But I think, and I so hesitate to say this because it sounds like I'm loading more onto the backs of bereaved people who already have so much loaded on our backs already. But the truth is that sometimes grief only becomes what we make of it. And it doesn't rise any higher than that. If I can't find that support for myself, I do without that support. And I think that's been especially made true during the pandemic. So, not sure if that helps, but other thoughts, questions? One of the greatest gifts that we get is not just in saying hello, but it is also learning how to say goodbye. It is not lost on me that we go to great expense and extravagance to celebrate the births of children and weddings. And we often leave grieving people to go it by themselves. And yet, what I have discovered in the losses of my own life is that it is usually true that the greatest growth for me occurs not when the sailing is smooth, but when the waters are rough. And usually not in the moment, but in the months and sometimes the years later, I look back and I say, yes, that was an awful, awful experience. And I am now better in the broken places. On February the 16th, 2017, I had picked up two dear friends of ours from their home and was driving north on I-35 10 minutes after I'd picked them up. The traffic on I-35 stopped, and so did I, but the 47,000-pound truck behind me did not. I am the only survivor from my car. Both of my friends died. I sustained a head injury that will follow me in some ways the rest of my life. You may or may not know it. Brenda probably does. When the day gets to be this late, my words become much more halting. The pauses become longer as I struggle to find what I'm trying to say. But about 18 months ago, after a particularly grueling seminar in which I had stuttered and stammered, a hospice chaplain whom I've known for probably 20 years came up to me and put his arm around me. And he said, "Bill, you are right. You have lost a step. Thanks for your support." But the intensity and the credibility and the authenticity with which you now speak is born of a life of great pain. And for that, my life and my work have been forever changed. That's the transformative power of loss. God bless you.
Thank you all for being here, and also, Bill, thank you so much. You've given us a lot to think about and to take home with us. And we want to let you know that Thomas McAfee is here for you. If there's anything you need or any questions you may have, we'd be glad to answer those for you. And we consider it an honor and a privilege to do that. So, and I want you to know, I think you're some of the most courageous people in Greenville because you took the step to come to this and to try to find some things that will help you. And grieving's not easy. You've been there, it's not easy. But we're grateful that we can be here for you, and just know that we care. And if there's anything we can do, just give us a call. Okay, thank you for coming. Be careful going home in the rain, and we'll look forward to seeing you again.